Hello and welcome to another exciting video. In this one, we'll be looking at the React hook flow. Understanding the order in which React hooks are called can be really helpful in using React hooks effectively. This diagram by Donovan can be really helpful in understanding this. And in this lesson, we will explore the life cycle of a function component with hooks with colorful console log statements so we know when one phase starts and when it ends. I recommend you watch this one slowly and watch it as many times as you need to. Also, definitely play around with the code yourself until you feel relatively comfortable with this. Understanding all of this is not critical to your success with using React, and most of the time you won't need to think about this at all, but understanding it can help you at times. Sometimes it could be useful to understand the order in which your code is going to be run when you are using React hooks. Now, I've made this little app that has a checkbox for showing a child, and inside of this box, this will be rendered when that checkbox is checked. When you click on this button, it's going to increment the count. As you can see over here, the way that this works is we have a child component here that's maintaining a count state. So here you can see the count state being maintained. And then that has a whole bunch of use effects here. As you can see, this one over here, then this one, which are simply logging onto the console when the callback is called and logging to the console in a cleanup function that it provides. Then we create our React element for rendering to the page, and then we log to the console that our render is finished, and then we return that React element we created. We are doing the same thing for our app component as well, except here we are maintaining a showChild boolean state. As you can see over here, we have all those use effects, and then we render a few React elements here for rendering this UI. Let's go ahead and take a look at what happens when we initially load this page. So let's go ahead and refresh this now. So the first thing that we see is this app render start. So in our app function that we see over here, this is the first line that gets printed as app render start. So this gets called when we are calling our React DOM.render and we are trying to render the app element. After this line of code that gets printed over here, the next thing that's getting called is the use state callback, and that's this line over here. So it says use state callback, and then we have this line. After that, it's calling app render end. So see that this one has not been used, this one has not been used, and we are directly going over here and it says app render end. And once the render end has been printed, after that you can see the use effect is kicking in. So one thing that we can derive from this is that once the application start, the render function gets called up, and after that any use state callbacks that are mentioned will be called, and then the render end is getting called, and after that the use effects are getting called. So for the app component that we have, let's see how these use effects are defined. So this is the first use effect that gets called, and it says use effect no dependency. So this is the order in which the use effect is getting called, and we see that it's the same order in which they are mentioned in the code. So this is the first one, use effect no dependencies, and then we have use effect empty dependencies. That's the second one over here. And finally, we have use effect with dependencies. That's over here. So the execution is exactly the same. Notice that we are not getting any cleanup consoles as of now because there's nothing to be cleaned up. Now, if I go ahead and explore the child component over here, we again have the child render start, and then the user state, and then we have the use effects mentioned over here. Now, if I go ahead and do note that this is the app use effect with dependencies, is the last message that we have. If I now go ahead and click on show child, I'll get this coming up. So here it says app render start, app render end, And you should notice that this time around, we are not getting this app user state callback at all. It's just the start and end. So we are not getting any user state callbacks called up. After that, immediately we are getting the child render start. And within the child render start, like how we had app user state callback, we are getting child user state callback. Finally, we are getting the child render end, and after that, use effect is kicking in. And the sequence is exactly the same how it was for the app component. Use effect no dependencies, use effect empty dependencies, and use effect with dependencies. So here you'll see the same workflow: child, use effect no dependencies, child, use effect empty dependencies, and child, use effect with dependencies. And within this, if you explore the code, you'll find that first this line is getting called, and here we have child use effect empty dependencies, and then we have child use effect with dependencies. And down below, you'll notice that we are now getting the cleanup use effect calls as well. So for the app, we are now getting cleanup calls. So cleanup calls are also getting called in the same way how they are defined in the code. Let's explore the app over here, and we'll go to the first use effect cleanup. Here it says use effect no dependencies cleanup, as you can see over here. And then it says use effect with dependency cleanup. So here we have use effect with dependency cleanup, and then we have use effect no dependencies. You'll notice that this one is not getting called at all. That is use effect empty dependency cleanup, because it does not have any dependencies, so it's not getting cleaned up at all. And that's the reason why you don't see it over here when the cleanup use effects are being called. And once the cleanups are called, after that we are getting the use effects called all over again. So here we have the use effect no dependency, this one, and then we have use effect with dependency over here. Since this was never cleaned up, that's the reason why it's not being called again. Now if I click on this increment counter, notice that this is the last message that we have in our console log. What happens now is you'll notice that the child render start, and this time around child use state is not getting called. It's directly going to child render end. And now within the child, we are getting the use effect cleanups call. So here we have use effect no dependencies cleanup, use effect with dependencies cleanup, and then we are calling the use effects. And this keeps on going till we keep on clicking this button. Now if I go back and uncheck this show child, you'll notice that app render start, app render end, and then the child use effect no dependencies cleanup, use effect dependency cleanup, use effect with dependency cleanup, and finally the app use effect no dependency cleanup with dependency cleanup, and then we are getting these use effect no dependencies and use effect with dependencies. So that's the workflow that we have over here for hooks. Now let's explore this diagram as well, which we showcased earlier in our video. So the first thing is that we get our lazy initializers. That's our use state callback. We get our render function that finishes after the lazy initializers are called. React will update the DOM. React also has a use layout effect hook that will be run here, that operates pretty similarly to the use effect. The browser updates the screen based on the updates to the DOM that React made, and then for our effects are going to be called. This is exactly what we observed in our example. When there's a state update, we get our render called. Our lazy initializers are not called. React is going to update the DOM. We get a cleanup of layout effects, and then our layout effects are run. Browser updates the screen, and then we get a cleanup of our effects, and then our effects are run. When the component is unmounted, we get the cleanup of all of our effects. Having a firm understanding on the order in which these things are called is not totally necessary for you to be effective with React. It can help you in some situations, so I encourage you to play around with this.